She kept 2 chairs on the porch, though only one of them had been used in 3 years. That was the thing about Maren Aldridge that people in the valley talked about when they talked about her at all, which was less and less, as the seasons turned and the road up to the Stillwater Ranch grew over with bunchgrass and neglect. 2 wooden rocking chairs, side by side, angled slightly toward the west where the last of the evening light came through the gap in the Absaroka Range and turned the creek into something that looked like poured copper. The left chair was hers, the right chair was Colm's, had been Colm's, still was Combs. If you asked her, which nobody did anymore, because the answer lived in the silence she gave back, and that silence had a weight to it that made people stop asking. Every evening when the work released her or when her body made the decision for her, which at 58 happened more often than she cared to admit, Maren Aldridge walked out to that porch and sat in the left chair and watched the valley go dark. 300 acres of creek-watered pasture and timber climbing up into the foothills of the Absaroka Range in Montana Territory in the autumn of 1882. 43 head of cattle, a hay barn with a lean that got worse every winter, a root cellar that flooded in spring, and a blue heeler named Kettle who had bitten every unfamiliar hand extended toward him since Colm died, and who showed no particular interest in reform. Maren and Colm Aldridge had built the Stillwater from raw ground. 34 years ago, they had come up this valley with a wagon, 2 horses, a cast-iron stove that weighed more than good sense should have allowed, and the kind of young conviction that mistakes itself for certainty. They had dug the first well by hand. They had raised the barn together, Maren holding timbers while Colm nailed them, both of them too stubborn to wait for help. That was 3 days' ride away. They had lost a daughter to diphtheria at the age of 4. They had nearly lost the ranch twice, once to drought and once to a winter so severe that the creek froze to the bottom and they burned furniture to keep the stove going. They had survived it all, not because they were lucky, but because they were the kind of people who treated stubbornness as a sacrament. Their surviving daughter, Liesl, was in St. Louis now, married to a clerk, and writing letters that came less often and said less each time. The polite, retreating letters of a woman who had decided that the life her parents had built was not the life she wanted, and who felt guilty about it in exact proportion to her relief. And then, Colm had died. Not dramatically, not in the way the territory usually took its men, no horse fall, no fever, and no violence. He had gone out one February morning to check the cattle. She had found him sitting against the fence post in the east pasture, with his hat still on and his hand still in his gloves, and the particular stillness about his face that told her everything before she reached him. His heart, the doctor in Hardin said later, it just stopped. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of running 300 acres alone at an age when the morning started with a negotiation between what hurt and what could be ignored. Of watching the fence line go slack, and the hay barn lean further, and the herd thin out because she could not ride as she needed to ride, and mend as she needed to mend, and be in 4 places at once as running land this size demanded. Kettle helped with the cattle, but Kettle was 10 years old and slowing down himself, though he would have bitten anyone who pointed this out. She wasn't beaten. Maren Aldridge didn't know how to be beaten. But she was something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same territory, and the difference was getting harder to map with each passing season. That was what she was thinking about, sitting in her chair on the porch on an evening in late September with the light doing its copper trick on the creek and Kettle pressed against her boot with the vigilant stillness of a dog who believes the entire valley is his personal responsibility, when she saw the figure on the road. Not on horseback, not in a wagon. Walking, coming up from the south, from the direction of the river crossing and the mail road beyond it, with the particular gait of someone who has been walking for a very long time and has made a kind of peace with it. A young man, she thought, or a boy who had been made to look like a man by whatever had put him on this road. Kettle saw him at the same moment. The dog's body went rigid against her ankle, every muscle pulling taut, his eyes locked on the approaching figure, with the fixed intensity of an animal, calculating the distance between observation and action. Maren put her hand on the dog's head. She said nothing. She watched the figure come closer, and something turned over in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what it was yet, but Kettle did. And for the first time since Calm died, the dog did not growl. He reached the gate and stopped. That was the first thing she noticed. He stopped. He didn't open it, didn't lean on it, and didn't call out. He just stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at the house and the barn and the pasture beyond with the slow, careful attention of someone reading a room before entering it. He was young, 21, maybe 22, though something about how he held himself suggested he had been living on the far side of his years for some time. His coat had been mended at both elbows with leather patches that didn't match. His boots had been resoled at least once with what looked like harness leather, stitched tight but wearing thin at the balls of the feet. He carried a canvas roll across his back, the kind a man uses when he has given up the luxury of a proper pack. No horse, no rifle, no sidearm. A hat that had once been brown and was now the color of road dust and weather and time. He took off the hat when he saw her watching from the porch, held it in front of him with both hands, the way men used to do when they approached a house where a woman might answer. Maren didn't move from her chair. Beside her, Kettle was sitting upright now, ears forward, watching the stranger with an expression she had never seen on the dog before. Not hostility, not the coiled readiness that preceded every other encounter with every other stranger. Something else. Attention, pure undivided attention, as a dog watches something it is trying to understand. "Ma'am," the young man said from the gate. His voice carried clearly in the still air. Not loud, just clear, the voice of someone who has learned to speak precisely because he has learned that most people only give you one sentence to matter in. "I've come a long way, and I won't waste your time. I can see from here that your east fence line has been repaired with wire that's too light for the gauge of your posts, and it's pulling loose in at least 3 sections. Your hay barn is leaning north, which means your center beam is either cracked or it's settled off the foundation stone. And your creek crossing down below has silted up enough that you're losing flow to the near pasture." He paused. "I know how to fix all of it." Maren looked at him. She had been looked at by a great many men in the years since Calm died. Land assessors, cattle buyers, neighbors with offers that weren't really offers, drifters looking for a meal or a place to sleep or something that wasn't nailed down. She had developed a manner of looking back that communicated a great deal without saying anything at all. "And who are you?" she said. "Torin Vass, ma'am. I've been working ranch country since I was 14. Working, or passing through." He didn't flinch. Most of them flinched at that, at the directness of a woman who had stopped softening her questions around the same time she stopped expecting soft answers. "Both, if I'm honest," he said. "More working than passing. But I won't stand here and tell you I've been in one place long, because I haven't. Where did you come from?" "Most recently Billings. Before that, a spread outside of Bozeman. Before that, a long way south." "That's a lot of befores for someone your age." "Yes, ma'am, it is." She looked at his hands. They were the right kind of hands, not soft, not the hands of a man who talks about work. Calloused across the palms and between the fingers in the places that come from wire and rope and leather. A deep scar across the back of his right hand, old and white, healed without stitching. She looked at his face. There was a bruise along his jaw, yellowing at the edges, maybe a week old. And there was something about his eyes that she couldn't dismiss. They were steady, not aggressive, not pleading, not calculating. Just steady, as a lantern is steady when the wind isn't reaching it. "What happened to your jaw?" she asked. A man in Billings who thought I'd taken something of his. "Had you?" "No, ma'am." And the man understood his mistake. Something moved in Maren's chest. Not warmth. Not yet. Recognition, perhaps, though she would not have called it that. She had known men who spoke like that, who carried themselves like that, and who let their restraint do the talking. She had married one of them. "What are you asking for?" she said. "A place to sleep and a share of meals in exchange. I'll work your land. I've had men make that offer before. I expect you have. The last one stayed 9 days. He got into the whiskey on the 3rd night and didn't stop. I had to drive him off with Colm's rifle, and he took a bridle and a set of farrier's tools on his way out. I don't drink, ma'am. The one before him was a good enough worker for 3 weeks. Then he started asking questions about the deed, where I kept it, whether my name was on it alone, whether I had thought about selling. He wasn't asking for himself." She let that sit. "And the one before that," she said, "was the worst of all, because he was kind. He was kind, and he worked hard, and he was patient, and it took me 2 months to understand that he was patient, because he was waiting. For me to trust him with the cash box, for me to leave him alone in the house." She looked at Torren Voss. "He left in the night, took $60 and a gold locket that had belonged to my mother. The $60 I could live without. The locket I cannot get back." The young man was quiet. He didn't apologize for the others. He didn't make promises. He just stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and let her say what she needed to say. Then he spoke. "I understand why you'd say no. I've got no references I can hand you. No letter from a previous employer. No way to prove I'm not the same as the ones who came before except by not being them, and that takes time. You've got no reason to give me." He put his hat back on. "If the answer is no, I'll be on my way, and I thank you for hearing me out. I passed a creek crossing about a 1/4 mile south. I'll camp there tonight and move on in the morning." "No trouble." He was already turning to leave. And that was when Maren Aldridge came the closest she had come since Colm died to doing something she could not fully explain. She almost said, "Wait." Almost. The word was in her throat, pressing against the back of her teeth, because there was something about this one that was different from the others, something she could not yet name, and Kettle still hadn't growled, and the evening light was turning the creek to copper, and the empty chair beside her was so empty it had its own gravity. But 34 years in this territory had taught Maren Aldridge that almost is where most mistakes begin, that the feeling in your chest is not the same thing as evidence. That wanting someone to be trustworthy and someone being trustworthy are 2 different countries, with a river between them. She opened her mouth to say the thing she always said, the safe thing, the word that kept the locket and the whiskey and the deed questions from happening again. She opened her mouth to say no. The sound came from the south pasture. Low at first, almost a vibration, more than a noise, the way you feel thunder before you hear it. Then it sharpened into something unmistakable. Cattle in distress. Not the restless lowing of animals wanting feed or water. This was the raw, guttural sound of fear, the sound cattle make when something they cannot see is pushing them somewhere they do not want to go. Maren was on her feet before the second wave of it reached the porch. She knew that sound. She had heard it twice before, once when a mountain lion had come down off the ridge in the winter of '79 and taken a calf within sight of the barn, and once when a late spring flood had caught 8 head in the creek bottom, and she and Colm had worked until midnight pulling them out of water that was trying to become a river. Kettle was already off the porch, his body low and fast, moving toward the south pasture with the focused urgency of a dog who has heard his entire job description spoken aloud in a single sound. Torren Voss had stopped at the gate. He had turned back. He wasn't looking at Maren. He was looking south, past the barn, past the near corral, toward the creek bottom where the land dipped and the pasture ran down to the water. His head was tilted slightly, as a person listens when they are sorting one sound from another, pulling information out of noise. "Your creek is rising," he said. His voice had changed. Not louder, but there was a certainty in it that hadn't been there before, the voice of someone who has stopped asking permission and started reading the situation. "There's been rain in the upper valley. I could smell it coming down. The water's been carrying silt since I crossed it an hour ago. You've got cattle in the low pasture below the bank." Maren stared at him. "How many head down there?" he asked. 12, maybe 14. Her voice sounded strange to her, pulled tight. "How fast does that creek come up when it decides to move?" "Fast. 20 minutes, maybe less." He was already moving, already through the gate, already looking at the corral where Maren's 2 horses stood with their ears up and their bodies angled toward the sound. The bay. Colm's horse, the one that hadn't accepted another rider since that February morning, was tossing his head and stamping. "I need that bay," Torrent said. "He looks like he'll hold in moving water. That horse hasn't been ridden by anyone but me in 3 years. He'll carry me. I need him now." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a demand. It was something in between, something that existed only in the narrow space where urgency meets certainty, and Maren Aldridge heard in it a thing she hadn't heard since Colm was alive. Competence, not promised, not argued, just there as the ground is there. She could already hear the water, a low, gathering hiss from the creek bottom, the sound of a creek remembering that it was, under the right conditions, a river. "Saddle's on the rail," she said. He didn't need to be told twice. Torren Vass could ride. That was not a thing Maren expected, because most of the men who came through talking about ranch work could sit a horse the way a sack of grain could sit a horse, which is to say they stayed on top of it through a combination of friction and good fortune. This was different. He had the bay saddled in under a minute, working the cinch and the bridle with the automatic speed of hands that have done a thing so many times the muscles no longer consult the brain. And when he swung up, the horse didn't shy, didn't test him, didn't do any of the things that Colm's bay had done to every other person who had tried to ride him since that February. The horse just went. Maren watched from the corral fence, her hands gripping the top rail. The creek that ran through the south pasture, the creek that was a gentle, reliable thing 11 months of the year, had turned. It was wider than it had been an hour ago, and it was the color of coffee, carrying silt and branches and the accumulated runoff of whatever rain had fallen in the upper valley that afternoon. It wasn't yet dangerous, but it was deciding whether to become dangerous, and creeks in this country made that decision quickly and did not reverse it. Torren took the bay down the slope at a controlled run, not reckless, not cautious, just exactly the speed that the terrain and the urgency demanded. He reached a low pasture, and Maren saw him pull up for a moment, reading the ground, reading the water, reading the cattle. The cattle were bunched at the far end of the pasture, pressed against the fence line where the land dipped lowest, which was exactly where they should not have been. Cattle will move toward water when they are nervous, which is one of the many ways in which cattle are not gifted with foresight. 14 head standing in grass that was already dark with rising water, and the creek beyond them swelling by the minute. Torren didn't push them. He didn't ride into the group fast and loud, as most men would, sending cattle scattering in 6 directions and turning a retrieval into a chase. He came at them from the downstream side, slow angling the bay in a wide arc that gave the herd room to see him and understand him before he asked them to move. And then Kettle was there. The dog had gone down the slope ahead of the horse, moving low through the wet grass, and he appeared now on the upstream flank of the herd, as if he had been placed there by design. As if he and this stranger had worked together for years, instead of minutes. Kettle moved along the waterside edge of the group with the precise, pressured trot of a dog, who understands that his job is not to frighten, but to persuade to make the direction he wants the cattle to go feel like the direction the cattle wanted to go all along. Maren's hands tightened on the fence rail. She hadn't seen Kettle work like that since Colm was alive. The dog had worked for her, yes, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of the stubborn duty that healers carry in their blood like a second heartbeat. But this was different. This was Kettle working with joy, with precision, with the unleashed competence of an animal who has found someone who speaks his language. They brought the cattle up together. Torren on the bay, Kettle on the left flank, the herd moving in a tight, calm line up the slope and away from the water. Not rushed, not panicked, and just moved. 14 head. Marin counted them through the gate into the upper pasture. 14. He hadn't lost a single animal. Behind the last cow, the creek made its decision. The water came up in a low, dark surge that swallowed the lower pasture in the space of 3 minutes, turning the ground where the cattle had been standing into a shallow, fast-moving current that would have taken legs out from under any animal still in it. 3 minutes. If he had been 3 minutes slower, she would have lost a third of her herd. Torin rode the bay back to where Marin was standing. He dismounted and held the reins out to her. The horse was breathing hard, but not lathered. Worked, but not spent. Handled right. 14 head all accounted for, he said. He wasn't breathing hard himself. Your fence line on the south side is too close to the floodplain. If this creek rises like that regularly, you'll want to move the grazing boundary up about 40 yards and put your winter line above the second bench. He looked toward the creek. Also, that silt buildup I mentioned at the crossing. It's acting like a partial dam. Clear it out in the dry season and you'll lose less ground next time. Marin held the reins. She looked at the bay, who had lowered his head and was standing beside Torin, with the relaxed posture of a horse who has found someone he is willing to listen to. She looked at Kettle, sitting at Torin's feet with the unmistakable expression of a dog who has located a person of competence and has no intention of relocating. She looked at Torin Vass. His boots were soaked to the knee. His coat was dark with creek water. He had a smear of mud across his forehead where he had pushed his hat back at some point during the retrieval. He was standing there, holding nothing, asking for nothing, having just saved a third of her livelihood in the space of 20 minutes. There's a room at the back of the barn, Marin said. It's small. There's a cot and a stove that works if you talk to it right. Blankets in the chest. Torin nodded. That's more than sufficient, ma'am. Supper is at 6. I eat on the porch when the weather holds. Yes, ma'am. There are 2 chairs on that porch, she said, and something crossed her voice that she didn't intend, something that came from the place where Colm's empty chair sat angled toward the west. You'll sit on the step. Yes, ma'am. She watched him lead the bay back to the corral, untack him with the same quiet efficiency he had shown saddling up, check each hoof, run a hand along the horse's flank in a gesture that wasn't performance but conversation. A man talking to an animal in the language animals understand. Then he turned the horse out and stood at the rail for a moment, looking at the land as Colm used to look at it, as if the land were saying something, and he was trying to hear it clearly. She turned and walked back toward the house. Kettle didn't follow her. The dog looked at Marin, looked at Torin, and then laid down at the barn door with the decisive finality of a creature who has chosen his post. Marin did not look back. She didn't need to. October settled over the Stillwater ranch with a slow withdrawal of warmth and a sharpening of light that makes everything look closer and more fragile than it did in summer. And Torin Vass worked. He didn't work as the others had worked. The men who had come before him with their promises and their 9-day tenures and their quiet inventories of what could be taken. Those men had worked with the visible effort of people who wanted to be seen working, who understood that labor performed in front of the boss counted double. Torin worked as waterworks on stone, steadily, without performance, without audience, changing things so gradually that you only noticed the difference when you stopped and looked at what had been there before. He fixed the east fence line first, not just the 3 sections he had identified from the gate, but the entire run, all the way to the northern tree line and back along the ridge. He pulled every strand of the light gauge wire that the previous owner of the local supply store had sold to Marin at full price, knowing it was wrong for the job, and replaced it with proper stock wire that he had found in a half-buried crate behind the barn. Wire that Colm had bought and never used. Still well under the rust, he shored up the hay barn. Marin came out one morning to find him underneath it with a jack he had fashioned from a section of pine trunk and a flat stone, lifting the center beam back onto the foundation stone it had slipped from. He had been under there since before dawn, working by lantern light, because the angle of the lean told him it wouldn't survive another heavy snow, and heavy snow was perhaps 6 weeks away. He cleared the silt dam at the creek crossing. 2 days of waist-deep work in water, so cold it turned his hands white, hauling rock in packed sediment by hand, because there was no other way to do it. When he was done, the creek ran clean and fast through the crossing, and the near pasture drained properly for the first time in 2 years. He did other things, smaller things, the kind of things that accumulate into the difference between a ranch that is surviving and a ranch that is functioning. He rehung the corral gate that had been dragging in the dirt since the hinge pin bent. He replaced rotted boards in the porch, matching the wood so closely that Maren had to look twice to find the new ones. He mended the harness leather she had been meaning to mend for 1.5 years. He did all of it without asking permission, without seeking approval, without mentioning it afterward. He was good with the cattle, better than good. He had the quality that Maren had seen in perhaps 3 people in her entire life, the ability to exist inside a herd without disturbing it, to move among 43 animals and have none of them register him as a threat or even as a presence, only as a fact, like the wind or the grass. He was good with the horses too, and this was harder for Maren to watch, because there was a mare in the North Corral, a sorrel named Duchess, who had been Combs' project. The horse he had been training when his heart stopped in the east pasture. Duchess hadn't allowed a human hand on her since that day. She had gone half wild with grief or confusion, or whatever it is that horses carry when the person they trusted disappears without explanation. Torrin didn't approach Duchess. He didn't try to touch her, didn't enter her corral. What he did was stand at the fence. Every morning before the work started, and every evening after it ended, he stood at the North Corral fence and simply existed near the mare, not watching her directly, not reaching out, just there, present, patient, as you sit with a person who is grieving, not trying to fix it, just letting them know the world still has people in it who will stay. By the 3rd week, Duchess was coming to the fence on her own. Not to be touched, not yet, just to be near the place where he stood. Maren saw this from the kitchen window and turned away quickly because there was something in her throat that she didn't want to examine. They ate supper together every evening at 6. When the weather held, they ate on the porch. Maren in her chair, Torrin on the step, kettle positioned precisely between them, receiving what he clearly considered his rightful share of attention from both directions. The empty chair sat where it always sat. Neither of them mentioned it. Torrin asked questions. Not many, and never personal, but always the right ones. Where does the snow load heaviest in a bad winter? Which sections of pasture hold up when the others go dry? Where did Calm put the winter hay, and why there, and not closer to the barn? That last question she caught. Where did Calm put the winter hay? Not, where do you put it? He had understood, without being told, that the systems on this ranch had been designed by someone who was no longer here, and that understanding those systems meant understanding the person who built them. Calm would like him. She caught herself thinking that, and stopped. Not, would have liked, would like. Present tense, as though Calm were still sitting in that chair, still angled toward the valley, still listening. She corrected herself inside her own head and felt the correction land like a stone dropping into deep water. She answered his questions, a little more each evening. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, not secrets, not confessions, just the accumulated knowledge of 34 years on this land that had no one else to receive it, where the elk cross in November, which fence posts were original and which Calm had replaced. The spot in the east pasture where wild columbine grew every June, just a small patch, but Calm had always walked around it rather than through it. She was giving him the map. She knew she was doing it. She wasn't sure she should be doing it. But the alternative was to let the map die with her, and that felt worse. There was something about Torrin Vass that she couldn't settle, and it wasn't any of the things she had feared. He was honest. She was certain of this. He worked without supervision. He never entered the house without invitation. He treated her with the respect she recognized as genuine because it lived in the small things, the things a person does when they aren't thinking about being watched. It was his silence that unsettled her. Not the silence of his evenings, which was comfortable, the silence of a person who listens more than he speaks. It was the silence around his past, the careful way he moved conversation away from certain ground, not sharply, but gently, as you steer a horse around a patch of ground you know to be soft. A long way south. Working ranch country since 14. A lot of befores. 3 sentences stretched across what must have been 7 or 8 years of living, and every one of those years sealed shut like a letter he had written and decided not to send. The first hard snow came in the second week of November, and with it the particular intimacy that winter forces on people who share a small piece of land at the edge of a large piece of wilderness. They were on the porch after supper, which was reckless in that cold, but Maren had always believed that surrendering the porch to winter was the first step in surrendering everything else. Torrin had said nothing about it, except to bring her a second blanket from the barn without being asked. She was wrapped in that blanket now, and Comb's old wool coat over it, and the coffee in her hands was doing more for her spirit than her body. The snow was falling in the straight, windless way that means it intends to keep falling for a long time. Kettle was wedged between Torrin's boots on the step, radiating the smug warmth of a dog who has arranged things to his satisfaction. "Torrin," Maren said. He looked at her. "What happened?" she said. "Before you came here." It wasn't a question. It was an opening, offered as you open a gate. Not pushing the animal through it, just making clear that the gate is no longer closed. He was quiet for a long time. The snow fell. "I had a sister," he said. Maren said nothing. "Naren, 4 years younger than me. Our mother raised us alone, outside of a town called Cotter's Mill in the Idaho Territory. Small homestead, 40 acres, a handful of cattle and a garden that fed us in the good years. She was a strong woman, our mother. She ran that place by herself after our father left when I was 6, and she never once let us see what it cost her." The coffee cooled in Maren's hands. "She got sick when I was 16. The kind of sick that doesn't come and go, the kind that stays and takes things from you one at a time. I took over the homestead. Naren was 12. I told her I'd keep it running. I told her nothing would change." He stopped. Everything changed. He looked at the snow. "I was 16 and I was running 40 acres and caring for a sick woman and raising a girl, and I didn't know enough. I knew the work, but I didn't know the other parts, the money parts, the planning parts. A man came through, offered a leasing deal on the grazing land. Guaranteed income," he said. "Stability. I signed it because I needed someone to tell me it was going to be all right, and he was the only one saying it." He was quiet again. "The lease had a buyout clause. I didn't understand. When my mother died that winter, the land transferred to me, and the clause activated. He had the legal right to purchase the 40 acres at a price that had been set in the lease, a third of what the land was worth. I fought it, went to the territorial office, talked to a lawyer who charged me money I didn't have. The lawyer told me the document was binding and I had signed it." Maren's hands tightened around the cup. "I lost the homestead in the spring of 79. Naren was 13. I sent her to our mother's sister in Boise. An aunt she'd met twice." He paused, and the pause had a weight to it that Maren recognized, the weight of a sentence that has been carried for years and has worn a groove in the person carrying it. "She cried when I put her on the coach. She asked me why I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't answer her because I didn't have an answer. The snow fell. I've been moving since, working where there's work, moving when there isn't. Sending money to Boise when I have it, which isn't enough and isn't often enough." He looked at his hands. "I write to her. She writes back. The letters are shorter each time." Maren set the cup down on the arm of her chair. You were 16, she said, old enough to know better. You were 16, she said again, and there was something in her voice that wasn't argument, but correction. The firm, gentle pressure of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know where guilt belongs and where it doesn't. A man saw a boy with more responsibility than sense, and he took advantage of it. That is what happened. The rest of it is what you've been telling yourself, and it isn't the same thing. Torin didn't answer. Kettle pressed harder against his boots. You've been carrying it, Marin said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the snow, at the valley going white, at the world simplifying itself as it does in winter when all the colors leave, and what remains is just the shape of things, carrying it like a stone in your pocket. You can walk with it, you can work with it, but your hand keeps going back to it. The question, she said, is whether you're going to set it down somewhere, or whether you're going to carry it until it's all you can feel. The snow fell between them. Kettle breathed. I don't know how to set it down, Torin said. His voice was steady, but only just. You learn, Marin said. Not all at once, just a little more each day. She picked up her cup. The coffee was cold, but she drank it anyway. Write to your sister, she said. Tell her where you are. Tell her it's a good place. She looked at the empty chair beside her, at the snow collecting on its arm, filling the space where a hand used to rest. Tell her you've stopped moving, she said. The rider came on a Tuesday, in the first week of December, when the ground was frozen hard and the sky had the low compressed look that means more snow is thinking about it. Marin saw him from the kitchen window. She had been washing the morning dishes, and her hands went still in the water. She knew the horse before she knew the man, a tall chestnut with white stockings, well-fed, well-groomed, the kind of horse that belongs to someone who has other people do his riding for him. And then she knew the man, Silas Carvel. Heavy coat, fur collar, the posture of a man who sits behind a desk 6 days a week and considers the 7th day's ride to be the outdoor portion of his life. Carvel represented the Gallatin River Land and Cattle Company, which was a name that sounded like a ranch and operated like a bank. They had been buying up small holdings in the valley for 2 years, assembling a patchwork of properties into something large enough to run at the scale that made Eastern investors happy. Carvel had come to Marin 3 times before, the first time with a letter, the second time with a number, the third time, 6 months ago, with a surveyor who had walked the property line with a chain and a notebook, while Carvel sat on his chestnut horse and explained to Marin, in the patient tone of a man who believes that patience is the same thing as kindness, that a woman alone on 300 acres. Marin had told him no 3 times. The third time she had told him with Combs' rifle across her lap, which had introduced a productive clarity to the conversation. Now he was back. And he was not alone. 2 men rode behind him, not surveyors. These men sat their horses as men sit horses when the horse is a tool, and the tool's purpose is to carry them to a place where a different kind of tool will be required. They wore heavy coats and sidearms, and they looked at the ranch house with the flat measuring gaze of people who have been paid to make a situation feel different than it felt before they arrived. Marin reached for the rifle that lived beside the kitchen door, and then she stopped, because through the window, past the corral, she could see Torin. He was already standing at the barn door, his coat on, his hat on. Watching the 3 riders approach with the same unhurried attention, he gave a fence line, or a shifting herd, or a creek that was deciding whether to flood. Kettle was beside him. Every hair on the dog's body was standing at attention. Marin set the rifle down. She walked out the back door toward the barn. You know that man? Torin asked without turning. Silas Carvel. Gallatin River, Land and Cattle Company. He wants this ranch. How many times has he asked? 3, the last time I had a rifle. Torin was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved from Carvel to the 2 riders flanking him, then back. Is there a document? He asked. A written offer, legal language. He's brought papers before. I didn't read them. Something changed in Torrent's face. Not alarm, not anger. Something colder than both. Something that moved behind his eyes like a shadow passing over still water. I need to see those papers, he said. But first, I need to speak with him. Marin looked at him. He was 21 years old and standing in a barn doorway in December, and the set of his shoulders had changed into something she hadn't seen before, something older than his years. Something that looked, for a moment, like the shape of a lesson learned at a cost that hadn't finished being paid. "Torrin," she said. He looked at her. "Be careful," he almost smiled. "I intend to be exact," he said. Torrin walked to the gate without hurry, without theater, with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have decided that how you approach a thing is half of how it ends. He stopped at the fence. He didn't open the gate. He stood squarely behind it, hands at his sides, and looked up at Silas Carvel on his tall chestnut horse. "Help you," he said. Carvel looked down at him. The man had a broad, well-fed face, clean-shaven except for a trimmed mustache style to suggest authority. His eyes were the color of creek mud, not unintelligent, just flat, the eyes of a man who has learned to see land as numbers and people as variables in a calculation he has already completed. "I'm here to speak with Mrs. Aldridge," Carvel said. His voice was pleasant. It was the kind of voice that knows it is pleasant and uses that knowledge as a tool. "Mrs. Aldridge isn't available. I manage operations at the Stillwater. You can speak with me." A pause. Carvel's eyes moved from Torrin to the house, then to the barn, then back. The two riders shifted slightly in their saddles. One of them had his hand resting on his thigh, close to his belt, in the casual way that is not casual. "And who might you be?" Carvel asked. "Torrin Vass. I've been running this ranch since September." "Running it." The word was repeated with the slight emphasis of a man who finds something amusing. "Son, I've been doing business in this valley for 2 years. I know every hand and every foreman within 30 miles. I have never heard your name. You're hearing it now." The pleasantness in Carvel's face shifted, not gone, but rearranged. "I have an offer from Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "A generous one. The Gallatin River Company is prepared to purchase the Stillwater at a price that exceeds its current assessed value by 12%. That is not a number I arrived at carelessly. Mrs. Aldridge has told you no 3 times. Circumstances change. Winter is coming. This ranch is understaffed. The fences are in disrepair. The herd has thinned. I am offering Mrs. Brad Aldridge a dignified exit from a situation that is becoming untenable. "The fences are repaired," Torrin said. "All of them. The herd is intact. The creek crossing is clear. The hay barn is shored, and the winter stores are laid in. Whatever circumstances you were counting on have changed." Something moved behind Carvel's eyes. The two riders exchanged a glance. "That may be," Carvel said. "But the facts of the valley remain. Small operations are consolidating. The economics of scale are not kind to a 300-acre ranch run by a widow and a seasonal hand. I'm not seasonal. Everyone's seasonal, son. The question is just how long the season lasts." Torrin looked at him for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was different. Not louder, not harder, but there was a precision to it that hadn't been there before. The precision of someone who is about to use a blade they have been carrying for a long time. "Mr. Carvel, I'd like to ask you about your standard purchase agreement. Specifically, the grazing lease conversion clause in Section 4. Silence. The one that allows the company to convert a lease agreement into a purchase option if certain production thresholds aren't met within 12 months. The thresholds that are set, if I had to guess, at levels that a small operator cannot realistically meet during a hard winter, which in this territory every winter is." Carvel's face didn't change, but his hands tightened on the reins. A small movement. A person who wasn't watching for it wouldn't have seen it. "I'd also like to ask," Torrin said, "about the lean acceleration provision in Section 7. The one that allows the company to call in any outstanding debt against the property if the landowner enters into a lease agreement and subsequently defaults, the provision that turns a grazing lease into a foreclosure instrument. The wind came down off the Absaroka Range and moved through the gate between them. How do I know about those clauses, Mr. Carvel? Because I signed a document that contained them. In a different territory, from a different man who used the same pleasant voice and the same patient tone and the same word. Generous. I was 16 years old, and I lost 40 acres and a home that my mother had built, and I have spent every day since then learning exactly how I was taken apart so that I would recognize it when I saw it happening to someone else. He looked at Carvel steadily. I am seeing it now. The two flanking riders were very still. Something had shifted in the space around the gate, something that had nothing to do with numbers or noise. Torren Voss was 21 years old and slight, and standing at a fence in the cold with no weapon visible, and he wasn't performing composure. He was composed. There is a difference that men who make their living reading other men can feel as they feel a change in the wind, and both riders felt it. You have 3 riders, Torren said. I am one man at a gate, but Mrs. Aldridge is in that house, and she has a rifle, and she has been patient with you for longer than you deserve. And if you look behind me, you'll see a dog at the barn door who has not taken his eyes off your horses since you arrived, and that dog, Mr. Carvel, has opinions about trespassers that I am not always able to moderate. Kettle, on cue or by instinct, let out a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a bark, but something in between that communicated, in the universal language of dogs, that this particular piece of ground was his, and his tolerance for negotiation was limited. The still water is not for sale, Torren said. Not today, not in the spring, not when the economics of scale become unkind. If you have a legal claim, file it. If you have an offer, put it in writing and send it to the territorial office, and we will have an attorney respond. But do not come to this gate again with men who carry sidearms and call it generosity. A long silence. The snow began again, light and fine, the kind that comes sideways. Carvel looked at Torren. He looked at the house where the shape of Maren Aldridge was visible in the kitchen window, backlit by the lamp, and though the rifle wasn't visible from the gate, both men knew it was there. You're making a mistake, Carvel said. I've made mistakes, Mr. Carvel. I know exactly what they feel like. This isn't one. Carvel held his gaze for another moment, then he turned his horse. The 2 riders followed. They went back down the road in the falling snow, and the sound of the hooves on frozen ground grew smaller and then was gone. Torren stood at the gate until the silence was complete. Then he turned. Maren was standing on the porch. She had the rifle in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, and she was looking at Torren Voss with an expression she hadn't worn since the last morning she had seen Colm walk out toward the east pasture, whole and strong and permanent. The expression of a woman who has found something she didn't know she had been looking for and is afraid to look at it directly for fear it will disappear. That evening, Maren did something she hadn't done since the night Colm died. She opened the door and said, "Come inside." Torren looked at her from the barn door. The snow was still falling, heavier now. Kettle was at his feet. "Ma'am, inside. You've been eating on the porch for 2 months. The temperature is 12 degrees, and I am not going to sit out there tonight, and neither are you." He came inside. He took off his hat at the door and his boots on the mat, and he stood in the kitchen of the house he hadn't entered uninvited since September. And Maren saw him look around the room with the careful attention of a person who understands that being admitted to a private space is not the same as being comfortable in it. She pointed at the table. He sat. She put food in front of him. Venison, stew, bread she had baked that morning, coffee so strong it was practically a declaration of intent. She sat across from him, and they ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that exists between people who have shared something that has not yet been spoken about, but doesn't need to be spoken about immediately. When the food was finished, Marin set her fork down. "How did you know?" she asked. "The clauses, the legal language. You recited it like you'd read it 100 times. "I have read it 100 times, Torrin said. "My copy. The one I signed. I kept it. I've carried it with me ever since. Every town I've passed through, every courthouse, every land office, I've sat down and read it again, and I've asked questions about the parts I didn't understand, and I've made people explain to me exactly how each line works and what it does, and how a man like the one who stood at your gate today uses each word as a lever." He looked at the table. "I couldn't unlearn the mistake, so I learned the mechanism. I learned how the machine works, because I knew, somewhere, that I would see it again. And I told myself that the next time I saw it, I would not be 16, and I would not be ignorant, and I would not stand there and let it happen." Marin was quiet. "You turned your wound into a weapon," she said. "I turned it into the only thing I could," he said. "Something useful." The fire shifted in the stove. The kitchen was warm in the way that kitchens are warm when the cold outside is real and the walls between are doing what walls are supposed to do. Marin reached behind her, to the shelf above the stove. She brought down a tin that Torrin hadn't seen before. She opened it, and inside was loose tea. Not the ordinary kind she used every day, but something else, something that smelled of bergamot and dried flowers, and a history she did not explain. She brewed it in a pot she took from the back of the shelf, a small ceramic pot with a chip on the spout and a pattern of blue birds that had faded with years of use. She poured 2 cups and pushed one across the table. "This was Colm's mother's tea," she said. "She brought it from County Kerry when she came over in 1842. Not this tea, this blend. She made it herself. Dried the flowers. Colm's sister sent me a packet of it every Christmas until she passed. I have enough for maybe 10 more cups." She looked at him. "I don't open it for small occasions." Torrin looked at the cup. He understood what it meant. She could see that he understood, and she could see that the understanding moved through him. Not fast, not dramatic, but deep-reaching down into the place where a person keeps the things that matter most. "I want to say something to you," Marin said, "and I want you to listen to it before you respond." He waited. "I've been on this land for 34 years. Colm and I built it from nothing. We lost a daughter here. We nearly lost everything twice, and then I lost him, and since that February, I have been holding it together as you hold water in your hands. Carefully, desperately, knowing that it's leaving, no matter what you do." She paused. "Lizzle doesn't want this land. She has said so in every letter she hasn't written, and every visit she hasn't made. When I die, this ranch will go to the territory, or it will go to Carvel, or it will go to someone who will look at 300 acres and see a number, not a life." She looked at him across the table. "I have a lawyer in Hardin. Pole. Practical. I've been writing to her since October." Torrin's hands were very still around the cup. "I want to make you a legal partner in the Stillwater. Not wages, not employment, ownership. 40% to start, with a provision for full transfer at my death or incapacitation, whichever comes first and whichever God prefers." She paused. "In exchange, you work this land with me through the winter and the spring. If we're both still standing in July, we sign the papers." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire moved in the stove. Outside, the snow was falling, with the patient commitment of a sky that has decided to bury the world. "Why?" Torrin said. His voice was rough at the edges, in a way it hadn't been before. "Because you are good," Marin said. "Because you work this land as if it matters to you. And I have watched enough men work land that doesn't matter to them to know the difference. Because you stood at that gate today, and you didn't flinch, and you didn't do anything foolish, and you used the worst thing that ever happened to you to protect someone else's home." She stopped. She started again. "And because you asked the same questions Colm used to ask. The words hung in the warm air. The water, the pastures, where the snow loads, where the elk cross. You're learning this land as he learned it, as he taught me to learn it, by listening to what it tells you. She looked at the table. I didn't see it at first. Or I saw it and I didn't want to name it because naming it would mean that I was letting go of something I have held onto since that February with both hands. She raised her eyes. He would have liked you, Colm. He would have stood at that gate beside you tonight, and he would not have said so, because he was not a man who said things, but you would have known. Torrin's eyes were bright. He didn't look away. He didn't try to hide what was happening on his face, and Merrin respected him for that, because there is a kind of courage in letting a true thing be visible that has nothing to do with fences or rifles or men on horses. I lost my mother's land, he said. I lost my sister's home. I have carried that every day since, and it has been the heaviest thing I have ever carried, and I have carried it alone. He looked at her. I will not lose yours. Merrin picked up her tea. Her hands were steady, which surprised her, because nothing else inside her was. I know, she said. That is why I am asking. They sat for a moment in the quiet. Then Torrin said, You poured me tea from a pot you opened 10 more times 9, Merrin said. I had a cup when Liesl was born. Something broke in his face, not apart but open, as ice breaks on a creek in spring. Not destruction, but release. And for the first time since September, Torrin Vass smiled. Not a large smile, not a performance. Just the real thing. Arriving in its own time, as real things do. Merrin smiled back. She hadn't expected to, and she didn't try to stop it. Well, she said, now that that's settled, finish your tea. It's too valuable to waste. Carvel came back in January. He came with a lawyer from Helena and a leather satchel full of documents and a tone that suggested he believed time and Winter had done his negotiating for him. Bersta. He found Torrin at the gate, Merrin on the porch, and Kettle positioned at the property line with the rigid, unblinking focus of a dog who has been waiting for this exact moment with a patience that borders on professional. Torrin spoke. The Stillwater Ranch is registered as a legal partnership with the Territorial Office in Hardin, Merrin, Aldridge, and Torrin Vass, co-owners and operators. Any future inquiries regarding the purchase or lease of this land should be directed to our attorney. He held out a card. The lawyer from Helena took it. The partnership is filed and witnessed, Torrin said. The property deed is updated. The title is clear. There are no outstanding liens, no grazing leases, and no buyout clauses for anyone to discover at a convenient moment. He looked at Carvel. Your offer is declined. If you would like to make a formal bid through legal channels, our attorney will review it and respond. But you will not come to this gate again. Carvel sat on his chestnut horse and looked at the ranch, at the fences repaired and tight, at the hay barn standing straight, at the cattle visible in the upper pasture, healthy, grouped, calm, at the smoke rising from the chimney and the light in the windows and the porch where a woman sat in a chair with a rifle she no longer needed to hold but held anyway, because some statements are worth making even when they have already been made. He looked at Torrin Vass. He looked for a long time. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the valley with his lawyer behind him, and the sound of the hooves on the frozen road grew small, and then was gone. He did not come back. The winter was hard, as Merrin had said it would be. 3 weeks in January when the temperature dropped below 0 and stayed there, when the creek froze solid and the water had to be hauled from the well in buckets that grew ice on their rims before you reached the trough. Mornings that began in darkness and ended in darkness, with a brief cold light between them, rationed out like something precious. Torrin worked through it without complaint, without commentary, with the quiet focus of someone for whom work is not a transaction, but a language. Merrin worked beside him, not as much as she once could have. Her knees and her back, and the particular arithmetic of 58 years of hard use made certain arguments that could not be overruled. But she was there, and for the first time in 3 winters, she wasn't alone in the barn at dawn, breaking ice off the waterline with numb hands, and wondering how many more mornings she had left before the land took the last of what she could give it. The respect between them moved quietly through what was done and what was noticed. Torrin never said the barn looks good. Marin never said you work hard. But she brewed the ordinary tea, strong as he liked it, and he stacked the firewood where she could reach it without bending. And these things were enough. These things were the language. By February, something had changed at the Stillwater that Marin could feel but couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Not the absence of difficulty. The difficulty was still there, coded into the land and the weather and the stubborn mathematics of a small ranch in hard country. It was the presence of something else alongside it. It was the sound of the barn door opening at dawn, and knowing that the person opening it wasn't a stranger. It was the sound of Kettle's nails on the porch boards at 6 in the evening, taking his position between the 2 humans who had, as far as he was concerned, finally arranged themselves into the correct configuration. It was the sound of the word we. We need to move the herd next week. We should check the east fence after the thaw. We'll need more hay before April. A word that had been absent from this ranch since that February returned to it now like water, returned to a dry creek bed, finding its old channels, settling into the grooves that had been waiting for it. In March, the letter came. Torrin was at the kitchen table when Marin brought it in from the road, a small envelope with a Boise postmark and careful handwriting that Marin recognized as a young woman's, measured and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who is thinking about each word before committing it to paper. Torrin looked at the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. He held it in his hands as he had held his hat that first day at the gate, with both hands, with care, as if the thing he was holding might be more fragile than it appeared. Then he opened it. Marin didn't ask what it said. She went to the stove and made coffee, and didn't turn around. She heard him read in silence. She heard the silence after he finished. And then she heard him breathe. One long breath, the kind a person takes when something that has been closed for a very long time has opened, and the opening hurts and helps in equal measure. "She's coming," he said. Marin turned. Torrin was looking at the letter with an expression she knew. She had worn it herself, the expression of a person receiving news that changes the shape of the world, trying to hold the old shape and the new shape in the same hands. "Naren, my sister, she wants to come in the summer. She wants to see where I am." Marin sat down across from him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd stop moving. I told her it was a good place. It is a good place. I told her about you, about the ranch, about Kettle." "What did she say about Kettle?" Torrin looked at the letter again. "She said a dog that bites everyone except the right person is not a bad dog. He's a dog with standards." Marin laughed. It was a short, startled sound, the laugh of a woman who hasn't laughed enough lately and is surprised to find the machinery still works. Torrin laughed too quietly, and Kettle looked up from the floor at both of them with the deeply offended expression of a dog who suspects he is being discussed without his consent. In April, the snow pulled back from the valley in slow, uneven stages, revealing the land beneath it the way water pulls back from a shore, leaving behind the shapes that had been there all along, just hidden, just waiting. The creek ran free, the grass came up in the south pasture, pale at first, then thickening into the deep green that meant the roots had held through the winter. And Duchess, the sorrel mare in the north corral, the horse who hadn't allowed a human hand since Colm died, did a thing that Marin had stopped believing was possible. She came to the fence where Torrin was standing. She came close, closer than she had ever come. And she put her head over the rail and pressed her muzzle against his chest and stood there, breathing, her eyes half closed, her whole body saying the thing that horses say when they have decided, in their own time and on their own terms, that this person can be trusted. Torrin put his hand on her neck. He didn't move. He just stood there with his hand on the horse and his eyes closed, and Maren, watching from the porch, did not pretend that her vision was clear because it was not. That evening, the first warm evening, the first evening that smelled of earth instead of ice, Maren sat in her chair on the porch and watched the light do its copper trick on the creek. Kettle was at her feet. The valley was quiet in the way that spring evenings in high country are quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of sound. The sound of things growing and moving and beginning. Torrin came up from the barn. He had washed at the basin and his hair was damp, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps the way he always stopped. 1 foot on the first board, ready to take his place on the step. Maren looked at the chair beside her. Com's chair. The chair that hadn't been sat in since that February morning, that she hadn't moved, hadn't covered, hadn't offered, because offering it would have meant admitting that the person it belonged to was truly gone, and that the space he had left behind was not a memorial but a vacancy. "Sit down," she said. Torrin looked at the step. "Not there," Maren said. She looked at the chair. "There." He understood. She could see that he understood, the same way he had understood the tea, the same way he had understood the questions about the land, not because it was explained to him, but because he listened to what the silences were saying. He climbed the steps. He sat down in the chair. The wood creaked under him, the sound of a thing bearing weight again, after a long time empty. They sat together. Maren in her chair, Torrin in his, Kettle draped across both their feet with the deeply satisfied expression of a dog who has brought order to a disordered world. The light moved across the creek and turned it to copper, and the Absaroka Range held the last of the snow on its high ridges against the blue April sky. "You know," Maren said, "when I used to sit out here alone, people in the valley thought I was waiting for something. They thought I was watching the road, hoping someone would come." She paused. They were wrong. I wasn't waiting for someone. I was sitting with what I'd lost, because sitting with it was the only way I knew to honor it. She looked at him. "But then you came up that road, and Kettle didn't growl, and you took your hat off at the gate, and I understood something I hadn't understood before." "What's that?" Torrin asked. "That honoring what you've lost and making room for what comes next are not different things. They are the same thing. They have always been the same thing. I just couldn't see it while the chair was empty." The light deepened. The creek moved. The cattle grazed in the long pasture below them, and somewhere in the north corral, Duchess stood at the fence, content for the first time in years to simply be where she was. Torrin was quiet. He looked at the valley, at the land he had walked every foot of, at the fences he had mended, and the barn he had shored, and the creek he had cleared, and at the woman beside him who had opened a door he had not yet knocked on, who had given him a horse when she had no reason to, who had poured him tea from a pot with 9 cups left, because she believed he was worth one of them. He hadn't known, walking up that road in September with resoled boots and nothing behind him and nothing ahead of him, that this was where the road was going. You never do. You walk, because walking is all you know how to do, and then one day you stop, and the stopping doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like arriving. "Maren," he said. "Yes. Thank you for saving me a seat." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She reached over and put her hand on the arm of his chair just for a moment to confirm that it was real, that it was there, that it wasn't going to disappear between one evening and the next. Then she took her hand back and picked up her coffee and watched the valley go dark. And beside her, in the chair that had been empty and was not empty anymore, Torrin Vass watched it too. Some things you wait for without knowing you are waiting. Some chairs you save without knowing who they are for, and some roads that look like they are going nowhere are going exactly where they need to go. You just have to walk long enough to find out.